On May 24th, 1956, the Eurovision Song Contest aired its first edition, held in Lugano, Switzerland. Based on the iconic Italian music festival San Remo, the contest has been acclaimed throughout its run for memorable music, elaborate staging, talented artists, and inclusiveness of various cultures and nationalities all throughout Europe. Its popularity knows no borders, with a notable example of this being the inclusion of Australia in 2015. With 69 successful editions under its belt, with the 70th having been held this year in 2026, it's an event that stood the test of time for decades. Among its library of thousands of songs, there are a few that are remembered in a different light from the celebratory and fun vibe that Euro fans all know and love. Some of these have a much more personal meaning to the artists behind them, while others reference real-life incidents. One of them was by Norwegian singer and songwriter Emmy. Being performed in the 69th edition of the contest in Basel, Switzerland in 2025, her song represented Ireland and failed to qualify for the final, finishing 13th out of 15 countries in the second semifinal. While the song has an infectious beat and falls within the Eurodance genre of music, the true story that inspired this tune is far from being something to dance to. It's the story of a dog taken off the streets of Moscow and used during a time of political tension to get in the lead of foreign adversaries and in the name of science, only for her to not see the results in the end. This is the story of Laika. The 1950s was an interesting era in history, to say the least. The nightmare of World War II was years behind a lot of minds. The civil rights movement was well underway with the Montgomery bus boycott. Rock and roll was the thing to listen to. And McDonald's made its debut.
Yes, Daddy McDonald's, keep poisoning me.
But while all of these notable events in society and culture had captured the attention of many folks at the time, they couldn't have staged the political storm that was happening in the world. The United States and the Soviet Union were in the midst of the Cold War. Following the fall of Nazi Germany in 1945, the Allied forces had been at odds with the Soviets and their allies being intent on spreading their communist ideology. This eventually led to the creation of West and East Germany not long after. The US went so far as to spread their ideologies throughout Western European nations to combat the Soviets, doing the same with theirs in Eastern nations. This, of course, had its impact on many sectors. Trade was a major one. Media, with both sides constantly pumping out copious amounts of propaganda to paint the other side in a negative light. And war, with the Korean and Vietnam Wars having lasting impacts, with all countries involved that are felt to this day. But space exploration is the one sector that would be the most unique, being both about technological advancements in science and computing, while also giving both sides a sense of nationalistic vanity in the process. This era would be dubbed the space race. Each major milestone would put you in a positive light and therefore leading the race. For example, Sputnik 1. Launched in 1957 by the Soviet Union, this was the first ever artificial satellite to orbit the Earth, with Sputnik 2 being planned to be launched that same year. This pushed the US to get further in the game, only for the Soviets to do the same once they caught wind. But it didn't take long for both sides to decide one thing: to put a living being in orbit. And the Soviets were already ahead in wanting to accomplish such a task. But at the price of another living being. Before they could send human beings up into space, Soviet researchers and engineers needed to see for how long a human could be sustained at such a location above Earth. This was understandable given how tough and taxing an experience like this would be on your body, from being launched to weightlessness for an extended period of time. In order to do these experiments, they needed subjects that would paint a picture that would be accurate enough for them so that they could feel confident about sending up people. So, what did they end up using? Stray animals. Which brings us to Laika. Having been named the Russian word for barker, she was taken off the streets of Moscow and thrusted into the USSR space program to be the subject for Sputnik 2. Now, when it came to the dogs used, scientists wanted to use those that were obedient and were able to withstand certain incredibly loud noises, which was already an entirely different experiment on its own. This, on top of the dogs having to be put in confined spaces for weeks on end to simulate Sputnik 2, was already not just unethical, but something that most people would consider to be inhumane. Even though Laika had gone through these tests and was ultimately chosen, she was actually more like a substitute for a different dog. This other dog ended up being not chosen, as it was reported she had puppies and the scientists didn't want to separate her from her babies. And as if this wasn't torturous enough, the Soviets didn't think she would make it back alive. In fact, they expected Laika to die. November 3rd, 1957 was the date for Sputnik 2's launch. Laika had gone through all her rigorous and brutal training and was found to be able to fit in the Sputnik capsule. Unlike the satellite that came before this mission, Sputnik 2 was an actual craft, but designed to fit an animal inside. But the capsule was designed to not be strong enough to return to Earth. Supposedly, their backup plan was to get a new craft built to collect her, but it was ultimately decided that she be expected to not make it back safely to Earth. Or, in other words, die at some point during the mission. November 3rd came, and Laika became a canine cosmonaut, albeit under dark circumstances. What happened in the time between the launch and the last contact with the craft was very up in the air for the longest time. Obviously, because the dogs can't speak English to speak to mission control, but also because of how restrictive information from the USSR came out, as they, just like their Western counterparts, wanted to be seen in the best light and be ahead in the game. Some speculated that she had died halfway through orbiting Earth, or that her time above Earth was successful but tragically passed away due to burning up upon re-entry. But the truth wouldn't be revealed until 2002 by Russian scientists, and they said that Laika had died during launch due to the insane amount of heat that was exerted on her body. So the whole time she was in orbit on her mission, no one could get a hold of the capsule because she was already gone. As disturbing and horrific as Laika's fate ended up being, regardless of how and when she died, she sadly wouldn't be the last animal to have suffered a similar fate. Some years after Sputnik 2's mission, 2 more dogs were sent by the Soviet Union, and they ended up being killed due to the spacecraft being intentionally destroyed during re-entry. Sure, there were many success stories where the animals had survived and ended up living for years after they got sent into space, but the attitude of the scientists whenever things went wrong is telling. Furthermore, it gets more disturbing when you remember that Sputnik 2 was never originally intended to be a survivable craft. It just goes to show how little people these Soviet scientists who worked on a national level specifically viewed animals like the living beings that they were. While the use of animals for testing conditions of survivability in space was easily raised in the US, the same couldn't be said about the Soviet Union. The USSR was a heavily repressive state under communist rule, and anything considered critical or even just out of slight concern, was seen in a negative light. Censorship at its best or worst, depending on how you look at it. One of the scientists who helped send Laika to space did eventually speak out to apologize for his actions and said that animal suffering causes all of us humans to suffer, which is a sentiment that many would agree with. We always encounter dogs at one point in our lives, and the majority of the population would look at them as precious creatures that we take care of and call our companions or even as family members. So whenever stories like Laika's get talked about, it sends a shockwave to so many of us because it's hard to fathom how people can be so cruel to another living being. Especially one that's been dubbed as man's best friend. Nowadays, thanks to technology advancing and more money being pumped into space programs all over the world, we are able to simulate space here on Earth as part of astronaut training programs, with arguably the most famous example being in NASA's Natural Buoyancy Laboratory in Houston, Texas. As for Laika, her memory lives on in many ways. Shortly after her death, collectible plates, stamps, and even tobacco products of her were sold all over the Soviet Union, and the popularity eventually reached the US, with plush toys even being sold of her. Laika LLC, the animation studio best known for making the 2009 animated film Coraline, is named after the titular space dog as well. A statue of Laika can be seen outside a training facility in Russia for cosmonauts. And finally, in 2025, Norwegian singer and songwriter Emmy decided to do her own take on Laika's story. In interviews with Eurovision fan sites Euromix and Eurovision, Emmy stated that she was always taught the story of the space star growing up and always dwelled on how tragic it must have been for the poor canine. So she decided to write her song, Laika Party, as a tribute, on top of giving the space dog an alternate ending. One where she never suffered and ended up having a fantastic time in space and partying like no tomorrow. The song would be entered in Ireland's selection contest for Eurovision in 2025 and won, giving Emmy the position of representing the country in Basel, Switzerland. As mentioned at the beginning, she finished 13th out of 15 countries in the second semifinal in Basel, never advancing to the final show. But while her song wasn't chosen to be in the final, it did do one thing: to tell Laika's story and remind the audience, in person and at home watching, that her memory will live on for years and decades to come.